One of the big tools that we currently have in cognitive science really goes back to the 70s and 80s, and here we have a book by Marvin Minsky, and what he did is he identified one of the really fundamental questions in psychology. So we know that brains are made up of neurons, which are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms. Each part of those things is not in itself intelligent or smart, and yet you put these things together, you arrange them in a particular configuration, and you get intelligence. You get wild intelligence. And what he wanted to do was think about how can you get sort of dumb pieces to come together and create a more intelligent whole. This is a little character called Buzzy. He's what's known as a cranium commando. And what he does is he sits inside the head of a 12-year-old boy named Bobby, and he runs the show. So he gets information from the hypothalamus, from the adrenal gland. He looks out into the screen that is Bobby's world, and he uses these levers and so on to control Bobby's motion. You're not going to be able to explain smartness by a really small smart thing. It's going to have to be with components that together make smartness. Here's something that's smart that consists of a large number of components. And the reason that we call these things smart is because they bundle together a lot of applications, and a key part of this is that these applications are specialized. They have a really narrow job. And even though these things have narrow jobs, when you bundle them all together, you get something that together gives you something which we call a smartphone. This is basically what's going on in your head as well. Just like a smartphone, the reason that you're smart is because your head, your brain, bundles together lots of information processing devices, applications, and so on. And together they give rise to what we experience as intelligence and so on. In the context of biology, what I want to do is call these adaptations. Elements of special design. These are things that have functions in virtue of the process of natural selection. And all these, what do these different little applications do? Well, they have these nice social functions. For example, we have adaptations designed to cause us to deliver benefits to our relatives, little parental investment mechanisms, to build alliances and friendships, to cause other people to like us and to like other people, to understand that other people have beliefs and desires, that they want things, and we can predict their behavior in virtue of thinking about those beliefs and those desires. Detecting cheaters, identify individuals who accept benefits without having paid the cost. Identifying inconsistencies in other people. No picture for the incest avoidance mechanism. You know what I'm talking about there. There's a deterrence system, so we take revenge on people by virtue of the fact that people who are vengeful tend to have fewer bad things done unto them because it makes bad things more costly for doers. You have some mate selection systems, well, we'll just pop through. Food choice systems. We have language systems designed for communication, obviously, social strategy systems having to do with me thinking about what you're thinking about me possibly doing in the context of transactions and so on. And then one of my favorite little applications, this is a moralistic judgment system. This is the module that sits around all day, watches other people's behavior, and picks out when somebody else has done something wrong. So all these things give rise to the social mind, to the human mind, to intelligence. When I talk about modularity, what I mean simply is something that has a narrow job, that has a function. So a real simple example of this is a photoreceptor. You all have these in your retinas. All a photoreceptor does is it sits around all day waiting for electromagnetic radiation of a particular wavelength. When something impinges on it, it sends that signal down into the visual system, and all sorts of interesting transactions happen downstream of that that gives rise to your visual experience. So a photoreceptor is a module, and it's a module that exists as part of a larger modular system, the retina, which exists as part of a larger modular system, the visual system. And so my argument here is simply that we can talk about modularity in terms of narrowness of function, just having a job in the nervous system. So those are the ground rules, and then all I want to do for the rest of the time is take you on a little bit of a trip to use these ideas to explain hypocrisy. The first step goes back to some work by my Gazzaniga colleagues. This is a split brain patient, so you all probably know that we have two different hemispheres of our brain, and some people, they sever the links that allow those two hemispheres to talk to each other, the communication links. When that happens, what you can do is show each hemisphere of the brain different images. And there's lots of interesting things that we know from these experiments, but I just want you to think about one question, which is, what did the patient see? There's no sensible way in which we can talk about what the patient as a whole saw, because the two halves of his brain saw two different things. And so what this means is that it potentially makes problematic talking about what the individual sees or what the individual believes, at least for these cases of patients. If it's true that if artificially modularized brains run into this problem of talking about what the person, the individual, the patient saw, if it's true that your brains are also modular, naturally modular, then we've got some other problems in talking about really seemingly simple things such as what we have and have not seen. Take a look at the square labeled A and the square labeled B. You can probably tell that these things look different in shade. Surprising as it might seem, take these two same shade squares, move them over, and they exactly match the squares there. One part of your head, one part of your brain has the experience of these as different shades. This is darker than that. So there's a sense in which one part of your head believes those two squares are different shades. There's another part of your head that believes they're the same shade. And so my claim there is that you have two different parts of your neural architecture, natural brains, that can contain mutually contradictory beliefs or representations, information. And those two pieces of information are exactly opposite. Now what that's telling us is that we need to start thinking about the mind as a series of components as opposed to a unified whole where different bits can believe different things. This idea, its utility is not limited to the perceptual system. This is some classic work done by Nisbet and Wilson in 1979, in which people were asked to choose among 4 exactly identical pairs of pantyhose outside of a little shopping mall. People were asked to just pick their favorite one, and if you ask people how they made the decision, they don't usually tell you the right answer, that they can't identify the real cause behind their decision. What that means is that there's some part of your head that's making the decision, that's causing the choice, and another part of your head, another part of your brain, that's talking about it without knowing. This is a phenomenon that we see in many different domains. We see it in the decision-making domain, we see it in the moral domain. We don't often know why it is that we do what we do. The idea here is that you've got all this stuff going on in your brain here, and what I want to argue is that there's another part of your brain that has a particular function which has to do with public relations, talking about why you did stuff. But the problem is, or at least a problem is, that these things that are driving your behavior often are not communicating to this system so that you can't give answers. What this is telling us is that you have all these little modules going ahead and driving your behavior, and you have this other system which is trying to explain it, but it just doesn't have access to the information. As social creatures, as the product of natural selection, we play lots of games with other people. That is, we're in a competitive environment where there's limited numbers of resources, friends, mates, and so on. And so my brain is designed to beat your brain in the social games that we play. So the first game is crossing the street in Philadelphia. Philadelphia drivers have this funny property. What they do is they look at an intersection and they figure out if the pedestrian has seen them coming or not. And if the pedestrian has seen them coming, then they can barrel through it, because Philadelphia pedestrians will run out of the way if they've seen the car coming. As a pedestrian, I can defend against this. And what I do is I just cross the street looking forward, looking at my cell phone, making sure the driver doesn't think that I've seen them coming. Because drivers won't barrel through the intersection if they think that you have no chance of escaping. What this means is that ignorance can actually be a useful strategy to prevent people from doing sorts of things. In social games, being ignorant or wrong can be an advantage. It just depends on the game. So this is Frogger, game from my childhood. You're a little frog. Once again, the task is to cross the street. When you're playing games against nature, if you just step out into the street without looking, it's just dead froggy, right? So being ignorant and wrong is useful when I'm playing with you in the social world, but it's not useful when I'm playing against nature. If you're a press secretary speaking on behalf of a government, if I know something potentially damaging and someone from the press asks me that question, I've either got to lie about it or divulge the damaging information. So if I go up to the front of the podium, behind the podium, to the front of the room, and I don't have that piece of information, I can't leak it, and I can't be accused of lying. So in the context of lots of different social transactions that we have, being ignorant can be useful in the transactions that we have with other people. In a great study by Patricia Cross done in the late 70s, we asked people who are college professors how good they are, and almost all of them say that they're above average. And similarly, about 2/3 of them rate themselves in the top quarter teaching performances. My claim here is not that these people are lying. I actually think that there is a sense in which these are sincere claims about your teaching skill. One kind of our answer is that, well, people think these overly positive things about themselves because we like to feel good about ourselves, And so if I think that I have a really good trait, I'm going to feel better, my self-esteem is going to go up. I think of this as the ostrich model. So the idea is that you can spare yourself those 15 seconds of existential terror by sticking your head in the sand. So ostriches like this don't leave baby ostriches, right? And so this idea that we do what we do in order to feel good about ourselves runs into this problem of what is the function of the module that you're talking about. Because natural selection doesn't build modules to make you feel good, it builds modules that lead to reproductive success. How can being wrong about my traits, abilities, and future give me a strategic advantage in the social world? And what I want to argue is that there's a sense in which these overly positive views of our traits and abilities have to do with what I call being strategically wrong. Wrong in this way that's advantageous to me. And the general idea is relatively straightforward. Here's a little cartoon of William James, and he had an idea about this way back in the 19th century. He talks about self-fulfilling prophecies, that the desire for a certain kind of truth brings about that special truth's existence. The analogy here is like a bank run. If we all think that a bank is going to run out of money, and of course what we're going to do is we're going to go withdraw our money from the bank, and then the bank really will run out of money. So you can bring about truths in the world simply through beliefs. So at the tail end here, I want to bring this back to hypocrisy. Again, what this thing does, this moralistic judgment system, is it evaluates others' behavior and condemns people for doing all kinds of different things like hitting you over the head with a baseball bat, or taking a leaf and grinding it up and rolling it up in a piece of paper and lighting fire to the end of it and inhaling, things like that. So we identify those acts and we say, okay, those things, we're going to call those things wrong, and once we say something's wrong, then we as a group get to beat up on the person who's done it. Okay? So you have these moralistic judgment systems that are designed to stop people from doing various kinds of things. At the same time that you've got these moralistic modules in your head, you have other systems in your head that cause your behavior, just as I talked about at the top of the talk. All those different mechanisms in your head designed to bring about good reproductive outcomes for yourself. So the idea here is that you've got these moralistic modules which cause you to publicly talk about how awful it is when other people do X, Y, or Z. At the same time, you've got other systems in your head which are designed around behavior. So here we've got someone decrying prostitution, and then you've got these other systems in your head which are designed to cause you to have various sorts of transactions with people of the opposite sex. So lastly, how do we get to the last piece? Well, what I want to argue is that being inconsistent often is a cost. When you see me doing X after I've said X is wrong, that hurts me. We don't like people who are inconsistent. And so you might say, well, why don't we just act really consistent? And the answer to that question is to be found in the old joke about the two guys. So they're out on a hike and there's a bear. And they see the bear, and the one guy starts putting his sneakers on, and his friend says, why are you putting your sneakers on? It's not like you can outrun a bear. And he says, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. I don't have to be perfectly consistent, I just have to be just consistent enough so that you don't notice my inconsistencies. And in fact, if I'm not inconsistent and I fail to take advantage of opportunities, by virtue of the fact that I'm trying to be consistent with my previous behaviors and beliefs, I might be worse off. By not noticing our own inconsistencies, we have the strategic advantage of passing below other people's radars without the possibility of giving up the game. So my claim here is that you think everyone is a hypocrite in general, but for strategic reasons, you actually think that everyone else is a hypocrite.
I had this ambition once to be a stand-up comedian. I was going to start my stand-up comedy act, but I could never get beyond the start with this phrase I said to myself, because it always seems to me the phrase I said to myself was a kind of bizarre phrase. Who is having this conversation? Who is involved here? That idea of I said to myself, what's going on then when we say that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think that there is this really stark intuition that there's a self to be talking to. I think this notion of talking to yourself, it sort of reifies this intuition that there really is a guy in there somewhere, and that there's other bits that somehow can talk to him. And so I think that this is one of the intuitions that gets in the way to some extent of thinking about the componential mind, the modular mind. I also think there's a little bit of a temporal element in there, that you sort of think about who you just were a second ago and how you had this other thought, and now you're telling the future self something about what it is that the past self believes. And so I do think that these things bring up this issue of ontology. How do we talk about what it means to be a me or a self?
Do you think that your ideas, derived as they are from evolutionary psychology and from experimental work, are they broadly compatible with kind of Freud's idea of these kind of warring parts of our personality?
Yeah, so I think that some of the material that I talk about really does have these quite lengthy historical roots. When you look at the psychology of the 19th century, I think that there's a sense in which the number of parts you divided things into, not hemispheres, but it was sort of two. There was this beginning of introspection, so this conscious stuff and this non-conscious stuff. And then with Freud, you sort of get up to three. id, ego, superego. And my view would be that this is the right direction, you're just not quite far enough, right? So it's really, and I probably will run into trouble for saying this, but it's maybe thousands, right? That there's all these different bits. And carving the mind into 2 or 3 probably isn't going to be enough. And the other thing is that you want to carve nature at its joints. And so I think that the functional approach here, that natural selection is doing the carving for us. It's telling us where are the jobs being done and so on.
How do you think this awareness of the idiosyncratic nature of this machinery, and Daniel Dennett's terms, that we're trying to negotiate a modern world with a prehistoric brain, how big do you think the implications of that are going to be for society?
We're not just idiosyncratic, we're very context sensitive, we're sensitive to history. And so these decision-making processes that occur in our heads really depend a lot on what's just happened, our particular state at the time, and the environment around us. And if that's true, then you have even an additional element for nudging people in the sense that if you start to be able to map systematically the relationship between various parts of the environment or the organism's state or the organism's recent history with decision-making, you can get quite a textured look at what decision-making is going to look like, sort of broadly. And I think as we make progress in understanding how these things work, what affects them, when one turns another one off, and so on, we're going to get a little bit better not just at predicting, and for better, for worse, being able to change the structure of decisions that people make.
This kind of recognition that our wants are not the same as our needs, and even our sense of what our needs are, is something which people who develop brand and advertising strategies are well aware of, and they're very clever at kind of marketing that. Do you think that there is an issue here about the fact that as we become more sophisticated in our understanding of this, that those kind of strategies that are aimed at tripping, making little connections which undermine our capacity for self-control and wisdom, they're going to be kind of slightly more exposed, and that brands are going to be slightly more careful about the way in which they communicate with us as we become more sophisticated?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I see this as a game that consumers are playing with the marketers. And of course, what happens is the market punishes brands that don't respect the ways in which consumers are making choices in the world. And so as consumers get more sophisticated in the choices that they make, you should see a response to that in the context of marketing and so on. That the firms that are able to take account of how it is that consumers are altering their choices in light of new information and new science and a more complex relationship with their consuming behavior, taking into account things like the environmental impacts and so forth. I think for sure you're going to see that marketing firms are going to trail right along that, because basically there's a game that's going on, and firms that don't take account of these changes are going to be punished by the market.